Today's scripture comes to us from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took Moab wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her sons or her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard the country of Moab that the Lord had had consideration for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought that there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So ends today's reading of the gospel.
Some years ago at a former church, I set out to preach about Ruth's loving loyalty toward her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so creatively, I came up with the sermon title of "How to Love Your Mother-in-Law." One couple walked into church on Sunday morning. The gentleman received his bulletin and he saw the sermon title and he looked at his wife and he said, "Honey, this would have been the perfect day for me to skip church and play golf." Joan Rivers, the entertainer, was famous for sharing with her mother-in-law that "my house is your house," at which point her mother-in-law said back to her, "Well, then get off my property." This classic line of Hebrew Bible scripture is beautiful. Where you go, I go. But might I suggest to you this morning that it is even more beautiful in its context. For when Ruth spoke those words to Naomi, it was a comeback to mother-in-law. For there was no legal, nor cultural, nor familial obligation for Ruth to follow Naomi. And we know that this conversation was rather pointed, for immediately before sharing those words of "where you go, I will go," Ruth says, "Don't press me." Or as some translations put it, "Don't beg me to leave you. I am going where you go. I am with you." Without question, these words are beautifully loving in their human context, for sure. But as one theologian taught me many years ago, there's something more perhaps going on in this text when it comes to Ruth's love that I would suggest back to you this morning for your consideration. My sense is that in Ruth's love for Naomi, what we actually get perhaps is a glimpse of God's love for each one of us. In an All Saints Sunday context, hear the good news. Where we go in our grief, where we go in our darkness and heartache over loss, God goes with us in a way that is, quite frankly, stubborn, persevering, dedicated, in a way that, frankly, is like talking back to mother-in-law. For I don't know about you, but when it comes to my grief, there are moments in that grief where I really need to know that God is with me no matter what. I think back to my own Stephen ministry training many years ago, and the training always suggests that what a person is needing to hear in the midst of their grief, that phrase that so resonates with anyone who is experiencing heartache is, "I am with you." Why does that phrase feel so comforting? Because that is precisely God's posture in our grief. I am with you wherever you go. And I think sometimes as people of faith and churchgoers, and I'm guilty of this too, we often have our cliche phrases that we use to talk to one another about grief that aren't quite as deep as that "I'm with you." You know, we say things like "he's in a better place," or "she's in a better place," or "everything happens for a reason," or, you know, you'll never get over it, but you will get through it. Or "God's timing is God's timing, and remember that God's timing is always right." Or some other kind of trite or cliche phrase that we commonly share with one another. But the problem with those back pocket sermons, if you will, that are rather cheap, is that they really don't get at the withness of God's love. They aren't as stubborn as that "come back to mother-in-law," "where you go, I will go." For it is in those words that we perhaps sense God's presence in the depth of our grief. For in those moments of darkness and loneliness, God says to us, "Where you go, I will go." In those moments of heartache in our grief, when we really do doubt and wonder what might be next, God says, "Where you go, I will go." Some grief experts refer to the phenomenon as Hallow Thanksmas. That's when Halloween pushes our grief forward into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we have to consider one more time what it's going to be like at the Thanksgiving table without someone we love, or at a Christmas family party without that person. And into that, God speaks those words to us perhaps. "Where you go, I go." Or for many in the congregation who have shared this back with me, there are those in your lives who have passed away that are younger than you are. Children and grandchildren and others whose time here on earth was just too soon. That is the loss that, not unlike that Naomi was experiencing in this text. And even into that unimaginable pain, God speaks those words, "Where you go, I go," there's a stubbornality about God's presence with us amidst the darkness that is our grief. It's Ruthian when you think about it. Some years back, I remember visiting with a widow in a former congregation, and she had just lost her husband. And she was sharing with me at her coffee table one of their favorite fall activities together. On fall Saturdays prior to University of South Carolina football games, she and her husband would go out into the yard and rake the fall leaves. She had wonderful memories of their doing this together. Fall came around, and of course, the work had to be done. She didn't want to do it at first because she knew the memories would be coming and flooding back at her, but she decided that she would rake the leaves. So she went out there one Saturday morning and began raking, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw that a little red bird came and perched itself on a fence post, a cardinal. And the bird sat there and watched her for 45 minutes. Rake the leaves. That's when she asked me, "Preacher, do you think it was him, or maybe was it God?" Now, as a minister over the years, I've always learned that it's better to be accused of going off the deep end than remaining in the shallow end. So my response back to Frances was, it might actually be both. Where you go, I will go. One of my favorite translations of Ruth 1:31, a classically beautiful line in Scripture, actually comes from the King James Version of Scripture. And that translation is, "Whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge." And I got to thinking about that version of this text, and I thought to myself, you know, in an All Saints Sunday context, that sounds very, very familiar to someone else that I know who spoke some words later in John's Gospel. "In my Father's house there are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have not told you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will one day return to take you to be with me. Where I go, you go, and where you go, I go." Decidedly Ruthian. As we journey forward in our grief, until that day comes where we lodgeth with Christ in the saints in heaven, may we know that God is with us, close by even, maybe even on the fence post.